They shall know not fear. They shall know not suffering nor pain. They shall march forth into the darkness and purge what lurks within. They shall be undaunted. They shall not waver, nor falter, nor yield. They shall be our shield. They shall be our Praetorians. Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of Shattered Legacies Deep Dive. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at the Cyratin Marines and the absolute mixed bag of nuts that call themselves as such. As per usual, this is going to be a long episode, our usual length episodes most likely, so sit back, relax, get some food, get a drink, and just get comfy, because we're going to go in hard. So, what is a Cyratin Marine? Well, a Cyratin Marine is one of the Cyratin Empire's super soldiers. The Cyratin Empire has 4 primary super soldier archetypes, and there are technically others, but they're usually so little used or so little is known about them that they're pretty much negligible. Number 1 is the Cyratin Marauders. You can kind of think of the Marauders from Doom 2018. They're super soldiers that prioritize speed and lethality above all else. There are the Cyratin Helsings, the Cyratin Empire's response to enemies that use excessive range whilst also having dirt cheap ammunition. They're literally soldiers that have revolvers that can snipe at like 10-20 miles away, because of course they can. Old lore. There are the Keepers. The Keepers was the Cyratin Empire's response to a necessity for specialized psionics and magic use, something that is normally mutually exclusive. And finally, there was the Cyratin Marines, the direct opposite of the Marauders, designed for durability, survivability, and, oddly enough, sustainability. Now, what do I mean by sustainability? Because I'm not talking about, sustainability in the terms of green energy or something. When it comes to the Cyratin Marines, they're literally designed to be able to be deployed out on any battlefront, no matter how severe it may be, and be completely self-sufficient. They don't require resupplies. They don't require rearming. They are designed to be able to stay out on the battlefield for sometimes months at a time before seeing any friendly forces that may have anything resembling some form of ammunition or armor replacements or anything. Cyratin Marines can oftentimes be closely associated with the Astartes from Warhammer 40k. However, they do have a very unique style. As per usual, it's difficult for me to explain a style. It'd be better if I could show you, but I still don't have art of this kind of stuff. That being said, if anybody's watching this and wants to start making fan art of it, or even contact me so that we can start collabing this stuff, hit me up. I'd be more than happy to start making art of the different concepts. Now, Cyratin Marines are utterly bizarre. When you look at Warhammer 40k, the Astartes are masculinity taken to absurd levels. They're muscular, but almost to a vulgar level. Something that nobody could find appealing. And it makes sense. Astartes are quite literally living weapons. That's their purpose. That's their job. It was brought up multiple times in 40k that, once war is gone, once there's not a need for war, what would happen to the Astartes? The majority of them could probably find something to do, but the majority of them, they'd be hard-pressed. The Cyratin Marines, on the other hand, are very different. We had talked before about Cyratin citizenship, and that just because you're born into the Cyratin Empire doesn't guarantee that you have Cyratin citizenship. You have to serve the Empire, rather, either in the military or in the civilian caste for X amount of years, and then you're granted citizenship for you and your next of kin. However, becoming a Cyratin Marine, even if you die on your first mission, you and your next of kin are immediately given citizenship because you are sacrificing quite a lot. Cyratin Marines have a lot of different augmentations. They're far larger than Astartes, and they have augmentations that Astartes could only dream of. Now keep in mind, a lot of these augmentations aren't fully fleshed out. In the grand scheme of the totality of the lore of Shattered Legacies, they're relatively new. Despite being in-universe, not new at all. They've been around for a very long time. We are currently on the 33rd generation of Cyratin Marines. Ironically enough, the same amount of empires that have existed. However, keep in mind that every single empire hasn't created a new generation, or rather a new mark. Cyratin Marines are on Mark 33 simply coincidentally. And honestly, I wouldn't really be able to compare them to Astartes. When it comes to Shattered Legacies, we take technology to just extreme, absurd levels. And as a result, it's difficult to really compare it to other popular sci-fi mediums. For example, if we were to put the Cyratin Empire, even the weakest of them all, up against the Imperium of Man, the Cyratin Empire would probably still win. It would be a close match. I'm not discrediting the Imperium of Man. They're powerful as hell, but I don't think that they could take out the Cyratin Empire. Now, as a general rule of thumb, humans are roughly between 5 and 6 feet tall in Shattered Legacies. Cyratins are roughly an inch taller, so somewhere between 6 and 7, whereas Cyratin Marines are a solid 8 feet tall, no matter what. They're fucking gigantic. And they're about as wide as they are tall. I mean, they're not 8 feet wide, but the weird thing about Cyratins is each individual is wholly unique. You can tell that just by glancing at them. But if you look at them for too long, you can't directly tell what it is, but your mind kind of has a feeling of just unnerving similarity between them. Even if you look at a group of them for long enough, you'll never notice what the similarity is. But there's almost like an itching at the back of your head, or at the back of your mind, rather, that there's something unnerving about Cyratins. There's some non-visible way in which they're all just identical. And like I say, it doesn't matter how long you look at a Cyratin or a group of them, you're never going to figure out what that is. Well, the same can be said for Cyratin Marines, only this uneasy feeling is brought to the forefront. They're still obviously individuals, but there is this very obvious sameness, almost like they're clones, even though they're very much not clones. Every Cyratin Marine is a volunteer that has chosen to undertake this Super Soldier project. However, despite that, the reason I had brought up Astartes before and said that they're muscular to a point of being vulgar is because Cyratin Marines are oddly enough very well proportioned. They're way more difficult to take down than an Astartes, but you'll find out of the augmentations that we do have, the Astartes do have some advantages over Cyratin Marines, but Cyratin Marines do have advantages over Astartes, obviously. Number one is their appearance. They look almost gorgeous. Kind of think the Sons of Sanguinius. You know, each of them is just very pleasing to look at because they are from Sanguinius's line. You can kind of think of Cyratin Marines in the same way until you start looking more south. Because the important thing to know about Cyratin Marines is this. They're obese. Now that may sound incredibly strange. Why is your super soldier obese? Why are they incredibly overweight? Well, this is the first augmentation that we get to talk about. And it's specifically like an organic vat on their stomach. It is designed to be able to preserve anything that is inside of it incredibly well and for an incredibly long time. The reason that they have this is part of that sustainability. Much like Astartes, at least I think this is Astartes lore. I don't know if it was ever retconned, but there was a thing where Astartes would eat high nutrient pastes or bars. And like if a normal person were to try and eat one, it would just kill them because it'd just be too much. You know, Cyratin Marines have something very similar. It's a paste that is insanely high nutrient that also has specific chemicals in it that work as stimulants for the Cyratin Marine to ensure that they remain at combat readiness at all times. And they literally gorge themselves on this, and their body automatically stores it in this sort of, I guess you could say, secondary stomach, where it's all preserved. So they literally go from the point of being incredibly ripped to high hell, like Astartes are, to the point of being quite literally visibly obese. And basically, their body will slowly utilize this high-density nutrient paste that is now in this quote-unquote second stomach, thus meaning that they don't require resupply for, like, food or water, because I was about to say Astartes. Certain Marines don't really need liquids. The paste really does give them everything that they need, and their metabolism has been very finely tuned to the point where even though they require this hyper-condensed, high-nutrients paste, they don't need a lot of it. Now, that being said, a Cyratin Marine would be fairly hard-pressed trying to survive off of normal Cyratin or human food. They would need to eat a lot of it. It's basically like the which chapter is it? The Space Wolves, I think. How they have literally just these absolutely fucking gigantic banquet feasts every single chance that they can, and it's just like an absurd amount of food. It would be that kind of situation. They would need a lot of normal food in order to actually be able to maintain their capacity to kill, to quote from a Warhammer 40k book. But so that is the first augmentation, and it's a very obvious one. One that is not so obvious, but definitely increases their survivability, is within Astartes, they have plates in their rib cage. Their rib cage is literally fused solid through a combination of bone and I think plasteel? I'm pretty sure it's either that or ceramite, but I don't think it's ceramite. But basically, it's literally like a chest plate. They fuse the bones of the ribs into a literal plate chest plate that protects all their vital organs. Cyratin Marines have something very similar to this, only it's located all over their body, and you wouldn't really notice it. The armor plating, quote unquote, that is underneath their skin is a combination of solid bone and corrodium. Now, we've talked about what corrodium is capable of before. It's basically the miracle metal. Anything you can imagine. Toughness and hardness taken to an absolute extreme with feather-light weight and relative flexibility when it's been refined. Not incredible flexibility, nothing like on the level of plasteel, which the Cyratin Empire does not possess. But corrodium is certainly superior in a lot of ways to something like plasteel or even adamantium. And so basically, every single location, every single patch of flesh around their body, with the exception of joints, directly under the skin is this armor plating of just bone and corrodium. And so not only do you have to punch through their armor, which for the majority of Cyratin Marines is made of solid solid 1/8 inch corrodium plates, But then you also have to get through this bone corrodium armor plating that is located directly below their skin. And there's no set width. You know, certain areas such as the arms, the legs, and the chest areas, and maybe even the head, they're fairly thick, but that's because they're important. Whereas locations like the fingers, which they do have the armor plating even below the skin of their fingers, again, with the exception of the joints, that way they can still move their different joints around and don't lose any mobility or flexibility, no manipulation loss. The armor plating is still present, but it is vastly weaker than, again, compared to somewhere that is more vital. In fact, the only place that this armor plating is not present is in the stomach area, simply because it has to be able to blow out in order for them to store that nutrient paste. Now, that being said, we get to the third augmentation, which is their skin itself, which has been it has been amplified, or spliced might be a better word. No. Basically, the Cyratin Empire took corrodium and turned it into dust, and then wove that corrodium dust into the very skin, on the very outer skin of their body, thus increasing the durability of their skin. Now, it's nowhere near on the level of actual corrodium armor, but it does make it somewhat more durable as a result. The skin itself isn't another layer of armor, even though it has these little, basically dust coating of corrodium woven through it. It's more so it increases its resilience so that if something punches through the armor, it's going to lose a lot of its force trying to punch through the armor. And then when it hits the skin, it's probably going to do damage, but the skin will most likely stop it before it hits that underlayer of bone corrodium armor plating. And if something is really armor penetrating and manages to get through all of that, you need something other than Cyratin Marines at that point. Needless to say, Cyratin Marines are incredibly durable. They're designed to be just literally walking tanks, damn near impossible to take down. Furthermore, Cyratin Marines have completely redundant organs. Almost every single organ in the body has a duplicate version of itself. So the Astartes have a third smaller lung to deal with things like atmospheric poisons and such. Cyratin Marines just flat out have two sets of fully formed, fully sized lungs. They have two hearts, just like Astartes, to help with blood flow as well as the lungs for increased air in the blood itself. They're optimized almost to the point of being machines, you know. That being said, Cyratin Marines are still designed to be able to do things outside of combat, you know. When the Emperor was still around back during the Great Crusade, you know, he had plans for a lot of the different legions, you know. Even when war was over, this legion could still do this, and that legion could still do that, you know. Obviously, certain legions, it's fairly obvious what they would do, you know. The Ultramarines, they would be statesmen, probably solely with an Ultramar, but regardless, you know. The sons of Sanguinius and Fulgrim would likely be artists and stuff like that, you know. The sons of Russ and the Lion, they'd most likely go around hunting apex predators, because let's be honest, that's what they do. You know, sons of something like Ferrus Manus and Vulcan would likely be making any piece of equipment imaginable, you know. Peter Turbo and Dorn, Perturabo, and Dorn would likely be building architecture and stuff like that, you know. There was a solid, I don't know what the hell the Sons of Mortarion or Horus would be doing, but let alone Conrad, holy hell. But regardless, you know, it was believed that every single legion had a purpose. Cyratin Marines are very similar. Every single Cyratin Marine has a purpose that they can do outside. They trade a lot of their life to become a Cyratin Marine, but that doesn't mean that they're completely exempt from life. When you become an Astartes, you're hypno-indoctrinated to pretty much only eat, breathe, and sleep Astartes. War, But that isn't the thing with Cyratin Marines. Whilst it's very unlikely that a Cyratin Marine will have time to go and visit family, they very much can. They have lives outside of war. The Cyratin Empire basically sees them as individuals who sacrificed pretty much everything to become the Cyratin Empire's ultimate soldier, whilst still giving them the time to go and hang out with family and have a life outside of just constant dark savage war like you would see in 40k. Let's see. What are some other augmentations that the Cyratin Marines have? I can't think of any right this second. I'll probably remember after the episode is over, because that's how my memory usually works. So let's go on to Cyratin Marine equipment. Now, Cyratin Marine power armor, or I guess I could just call them Space Marines, because that's way easier. Space Marine power armor is very unique looking. It looks like more of an exoskeleton rather than power armor like you would see from the Astartes or hell, even Fallout universe. It looks like an exoskeleton that has armor plates attached to it. And honestly, that's really all it needs to be. Cyratin Marines don't have a neural link. Astartes have the black carapace, which allows them to integrate with their power armor to the point where their power armor is just essentially a second skin. Cyratin Marines don't have something like that. Certain Cyratin Marines can get neural plugs to plug into their armor, but it's relatively uncommon and usually saved for more experienced or elite Cyratin Marines. That being said, even if it's down solely to their own individual reflexes, they're still incredibly difficult to take down because, as I said, their armor plates are 1/8 corrodium armor plates. There is not a lot of things in Shattered Legacies that can get through that level of armor. And keep in mind, 1/8 of an inch. That is very thin armor, but we're also talking about how insane corrodium is. If you had steel armor like that, it would not go very far. Or hell, let's actually talk about legitimate tanks, as that's kind of what Cyratin Marines are. Like, the M1 Abrams, I believe, has ceramic armor plates. What, 1/8 of an inch armor would not be a lot. I don't know a lot about armor plates, about real war machines or war vehicles in the real world, but I would have to say, in my own personal guess, I would guess that's probably a light or medium armored vehicle. Like, I don't think that's like a heavily armored tank like the M1 Abrams. I think the M1 Abrams is a heavy tank. I don't know. I know very little about war vehicles. But anyway, the thing is that, like I've said multiple times now, corrodium is just absolutely ridiculously durable and hard. And as a result, 1/8 of an inch of armor plating, like I said, there's not a lot of things that can get through that, Concentrated Solstite attacks, like a Solstite beamer, would be able to get through. That's not an actual weapon. I'm just saying, like, if a Solstite rifle had a laser beam mode, it could probably melt through the armor relatively quickly. Antimatter would turn it into Swiss cheese. Plasmite would require sustained fire from Plasmite. Something as primitive as pulse weaponry, which is an old school of Cyratin technology. It's basically impossible to punch through corrodium plating with pulse munitions. Now let's compare this to something like the Human Empire. They're primarily at the level of plasma. However, it's not plasma that you typically think of in a lot of different sci-fi mediums. This plasma is ultra hot. Like, it's real plasma, and it melts through shit. You know? The Cyratin Empire considers plasma to be relatively primitive as all hell, especially considering the fact that they have Solstite and antimatter now. But plasma is definitely a lot more powerful than pulse. But then you may be questioning, well, why did the Cyratin Empire create pulse weapons after plasma? Well, that's because of a little problem called the Baramon, which we still need to do a deep dive on. Plasma just basically pissed them off to the point where they went into a berserking rage, and the Cyratin Empire was like, yeah, this isn't ending out too well for us. We need a new weapon. Da-da-da-da, intro pulse technology, which changed the battlefield during that specific era. You know? However, compared to everything else, pulse is largely utilized by Cyratin law enforcement. Now we're getting off track. Cyratin Marines, primarily, their armor has a lot of different systems that aid them. You know, they have their own onboard AI, kind of like Master Chief and Cortana. Not actually like Cortana, but, you know, it has an onboard AI that helps with targeting as well as target priority, indicating possible vectors of attack, the best locations to fire from, locations that you'll have the least chance of getting hit from. You know, it's a very complex AI that helps them with basically everything, you know. And just like Astartes helmets, it's capable of a whole host, a massive suite of different capabilities, such as being able to change your vision mode and all sorts of crazy stuff, you know. Basically anything that you would expect a sci-fi helmet that has a HUD built into it would be capable of doing, they're capable of doing it. Every single Cyratin Marine power armor, or yeah, I guess power armor, has its own reactor as well. Now, when it comes to reactors, we kind of talked about different forms of power generation within the Cyratin Empire. And within Cyratin power armor, it's largely nuclear or fusion, depending on the quality, which I guess is a good time to get into the structure. Now, I'm not going to go fully into it, but basically, Cyratin Marines are divided up into divisions, and it can go anywhere from triple digit to an infinite amount. Then you have your double digit divisions, and then you have your single digit divisions, you know, and triple digit and beyond is considered to be the status quo, whereas double digits is oftentimes divisions that will be formed and then disbanded for specific purposes, you know, and then single digits, that's where your like veterans and elites go. You know, these are the guys that are packing the war gear that will have fusion reactors, whereas everything else will largely most likely be nuclear. Now, let's get into weapons, because that's some of the more interesting stuff. The standard issue weapon for Cyratin Marines is known as the Ballista. And despite its name, no, it is not the medieval ballista. It's basically taken Astartes' bolter and remove the explosives, but spike the velocity. It's literally a shell, like a deer slug, that is the size of like a 40mm grenade that is just shot at hypersonic speeds and just rips through anything it touches. Like, it has such incredible force and velocity that it doesn't need the explosive tips of bolters. It just punches through things with brute force. Now, this is a standard issue, and oftentimes is given to, you know, Cyratin Marines that may have only just joined the game. You know, they've fully leveled up, they've fully been augmented, you know, they're ready to be officially be called Cyratin Marines, but they're not necessarily your veterans or your champions or what have you, you know? There is also the Ballast, which is basically a heavy version of the Ballista. bigger, more barrels. In fact, it has 3 barrels that it can fire from. Much higher force, much higher velocity. Hits like a goddamn boulder, you know? It's gonna do some serious damage, has way higher rate of fire, obviously far more difficult to use, and as a result, any Cyratin Marine, despite how insanely overpowered these guys are, it oftentimes will require a stability arm, kind of like the what are they called? The smart guns, I think is what they're called, from the Aliens universe. I think that's what they're called. How they have that little stabilization arm that goes to their backpack to help steady the weapon while they're firing it. It's sort of like that. You know, they need a heavy-duty prosthetic arm that is connected to their back in order to help with the stability and the sheer recoil as this thing roars out ballista rounds. Now, that being said, once again, this is largely given to your standard common Joe. Cyratin Marines obviously have everything bigger. They don't have plasmite rifles, they have plasmite carbines. And these things are fucking huge. Their power output is way higher, and instead of dealing like instead of melting a hole in something the size of your fist, it's like melting a hole in something the size of your head. They're just insanely powerful. They have Solstite variants as well, Solstite carbines. They even have plasmite and Solstite cannons, which, as you can imagine, incredibly slow firing, oftentimes have to be cooled down in a very literal sense between shots, but they just blast like fucking massive doorway-sized holes in just about anything. Now, that being said, Cyratin Marines, despite everything that they have going for them in terms of survivability, they're not fools, you know? They do have this sort of sense of immortality like Astartes have. You know, there was actually a animation on YouTube called Astartes. If you haven't seen it, it's fucking phenomenal. Absolutely watch it. It's so good. You get so many things actually right about the 40K universe, but in one of the scenes, Astartes is quite literally being shot at by overwhelming firepower, and instead of immediately ducking into cover, he takes a shot, and only after his shot fails, then he goes into cover. You know, him killing the target is more important than him protecting his life, simply because he knows that his armor can take it. Cyratin Marines are very similar, but they're not afraid to use cover when it's more beneficial than trying to take the shot because they know their armor can handle it. And this is largely due to the fact that Cyratin Marines are designed to be very self-sufficient. You know, they're designed to be very sustainable. And as a result, they're far more worried about protecting their armor plate. I mean, they'll take damage if they have to, if they need to, in order to gain a massive boon. But by and large, they will use a lot of cover, which is ridiculous when you think of a Space Marine. But the reasoning for that is because Cyratin Marines are expected. It's not, you know, they can do this, so it's handy that they can. No, they are expected to go months at a time without resupply. And as a result, the majority of the weapons the Cyratin Marines will actually be using when they're expected to go on these types of missions will be energy weapons rather than kinetic weapons. You know, you won't see a lot of ballists or ballistas because they require kinetic solid rounds. And eventually, you will shoot enough that you will run out. However, Cyratin Marine energy weapons, they recharge over time. So, you know, they're still conservative with their ammunition because it takes a while to recharge, but it's like, you know, they can literally just unleash hell on the enemy and then just saunter off because their weapon will eventually recharge thanks to the reactor that's inside of their weapons, whether that be the cannons or the carbines or whatever have you. even the sidearms that they have that are energy based, they have micro reactors because the Cyratin Empire has managed to master micro technology. You know, I'm not talking micro technology like the circuit boards and shit that is in your cell phone that is sitting in your pocket right now or wherever it is. I'm talking take a reactor the size of a real world nuclear reactor and make it small enough to fit in your pocket. Miniaturization technology, that sort of thing. Furthermore, the Cyratin Empire is coming out with a nanotech, which is utterly bizarre that they managed to get to antimatter, but nanotech was just too difficult. They're only just now getting to it after having unlocked fucking antimatter. But whatever. The Cyratin Empire is all kinds of weird. Like, teleportation is literally an impossibility for them to use. To be fair, the majority of other factions can't use it. The Florians have managed to master teleportation. But we'll get to that in a bit because that does pertain to Cyratin Marines. So, well, I guess we can get to it right now. There's a lot of other stuff, like they do have melee weapons, which are largely combat knives, which, much like Astartes, I always love this fact. And Astartes or Cyratin Marine combat knife that is literally a knife in their hands is like a fucking broadsword or a greatsword in the hands of an unaugmented human. Like, they're fucking massive. You don't really notice it when it's like in art and stuff of a Cyratin Marine holding it. It just looks like a knife. No, it's like a broadsword for a normal person. They're fucking huge. You know, but Cyratin Marines, they do have combat knives as their melee weapon, and they are specifically vibro knives. Now, this isn't an unknown concept. Vibro knives are based, I think it was most popularly coined in Star Wars, if I'm not mistaken. But basically, a vibro knife is the entirety of the blade is vibrating at insanely fast speeds, which allows it to essentially work like, it's not literally going at light speed, but it's basically like a miniature light speed chainsaw that just carves through almost anything it touches. It has a hard time getting through something like corrodium armor, but it can carve through anything. Now, that being said, that is not the same as mono-edged technology. They are two very different things. Vibrotech is, like I said, the blade itself is vibrating like a light speed chainsaw. So it just cuts its way through things with, again, insanely fast vibrations. Whereas mono-edge technology is literally the edge of the blade is sharpened down to the molecular level. So, like, if you were to put a knife under a magnifying glass, or that might not be enough. Let's say a microscope. I don't remember exactly which one it is. But it's actually, the edge of a knife is like the teeth of a construction saw. And basically, when you sharpen it with a whetstone, all it's doing is realigning those jagged teeth back in a singular line. That's why knives, they tell you should cut rather than just trying to push the knife down like you're trying to cut a thing of butter. You cut it. You drag it across. That way, all of those really, 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 really tiny teeth are dragging across it, cutting it. That's how a knife works. Whereas with monotech or mono-edged, those teeth are taken all the way down to the very smallest molecules of the blade, and they're aligned across that. So theoretically, if you had a mono-edged blade, it could literally cut through anything, even solstite and corrodium, because it's not just cutting the material, it's cutting the it's cutting the bonds between the molecules of whatever it is you're cutting. They're incredibly dangerous, but they're also insanely expensive and rare, even within the Cyratin Empire. And oddly enough, the Cyratin Empire is the only ones that have this kind of this tech. You know, Florians don't have it. It's not because they couldn't do it, but Florians largely don't really give a shit about melee combat, and oftentimes when they are in melee combat, it's with very brittle, meaty flesh suits. that they can simply just punch and turn into vapor. Like, they don't need mono edge. They don't need to cut through something like that because they're either going to vaporize it at long range or just punch it into a fine red mist because they can. You know? Humans, Yvetans, Bastilians, Barramon, they haven't really unlocked this level of technology. You'll find as we go through those other races, their technological level is vastly inferior to the Cyratins. When it comes to just sheer technological level, Florians are on top, followed by the Cyratins, followed by the humans, and then followed by the Barramon. Whereas the Bastilians and Yvetans, their technological level is largely the same. It's more of like a medieval era with still very high-tech aspects to it, you know? So, like, let's say for a second that the Bastilians and the Yvetans actually had mono-edged tech, it would largely be like gladiuses and arrows that would be mono-edged. You know, they don't use very high-end, hyper-advanced technology. And this is mainly out of choice. With the Bastilians, they use incredibly sharp blades because they're prized as infantry. And the Bastilians believe that melee combat is the best way. Whereas the Yvetans, they're far more focused on their magic. They could give a shit less about technology when they can just do everything they want with magic. Once again, we're getting off of the point. Cyratin Marines do have melee weapons, and that is specifically vibro combat knives, which can be turned on and off. It's not like it's in its sheath and it's just constantly vibrating there and eventually just going to cut through its own sheath. No, it can be turned on and off. Kind of like a flashlight. You click the button and suddenly it's moving at insane speeds and it's like, I can do some damage with this. So, let's get into Cyratin Marine structures. As I had said before, Cyratin Marines are divided up into divisions, and there's not technically a limit on the amount of divisions. Within a single division, there are multiple companies, and then multiple squads, or hundreds of different squads, depending on how big the division is. So, the division is all of the Cyratin Marines that are in, basically, the division is Astartes chapters. You know, that's what a division is. Only some of them are on the size of literal Astartes legions. You know, they're absolutely massive. Whereas a company is... Actually, I think it's called the same thing in Astartes. You know, the 10 companies, I think is what they're called. You know, but it's basically that subgroup. And then finally you have squads, which is usually a handful of Cyratin Marines that are working together on a specific operation. And so there isn't really chapter masters, you know. There are leaders of divisions. They're called generals. The Cyratin Marines have 3 different ranks. You have the standard rank, which doesn't really have a name. This is just your common boots on the ground foot soldier type of, you know, this is your common Cyratin Marine. After that, you have the lieutenant, which is basically an aide to the general, who is in charge of everything within a division. And every single division has one. Now, as I had said before, if you're a triple-digit division or above, these are considered to be the standard battle divisions. You know, it's exceptionally rare that an entire division, especially a big one, is deployed all at once. It is exceptionally rare. You know, it's just like back during the Great Crusade. They didn't unleash an entire legion on a target, from what I can remember. You know, they basically divvied up the legions to specific operations, and that section of the legion would go and do this thing. That one would go do that one. As far as I'm aware, I don't know. I don't remember a whole lot about the Great Crusade. I haven't read up on it. Hell, I still have to finish the Horus Heresy, so, you know, there's probably a lot of details there I'm missing. But there are situations where an entire division will be deployed. Now, you get to the double-digit divisions, and these are largely... There are small groups of Cyratin Marines that are brought together from various different divisions. So basically, when you are brought out of the surgery room, when you're brought out of training, you're officially one of the Cyratin Marines. You are assigned a Cyratin Marine division that is either triple digit or higher. And that's basically like, that's your chapter, you know? No matter what strike force you go into, you'll always return to that original division, you know? It's basically like the Indomitus Crusade, the unnumbered sons, you know? Like, there were a handful of Ultramarines mixed in with a handful of Dark Angels mixed in with a handful of Space Wolves, you know? And it's like, they're all working together. This would be a double-digit division, but they're still part of the Ultramarines. They're still part of the Dark Angels. They're still part of the Space Wolves, you know? So they will, when everything is said and done, go back to their original division. And then you have the single-digit divisions, which is Division 2 through 9. If you manage to distinguish yourself within the Cyratin Marines, which, keep in mind, Cyratin Marines as a whole are considered to be the elite of the Cyratin military, you know? You have the Cyratin Royal Army, which is essentially the equivalent of the Astra Militarum, and then you have the Cyratin Marines, which are basically the Astartes. And so they're already considered to be the elite. But if you're placed within Division 2 through 9, you are the elite of the elite, you know? These are essentially your special forces. These are Cyratin Marine divisions that are very well trained. These are your veterans, your champions, you know, like, these are the guys that can do some serious damage when they're unleashed. And that's kind of the point, you know? Their divisions are oftentimes very small, and they're deployed to deal with a number of different situations. However, then you have Division 1, known as the Praetorian Guard. If you are elected to be removed from one of the single-digit divisions and join Division 1, you are the elite of the elite of the elite. You know, this is essentially like in Warhammer 40k, Division 1 would be like a chapter that is entirely comprised of chapter masters. You know, these are the guys that will fuck up your day, no matter who it is. And I'm not just talking plot armor reasons. Although, an important thing to remember about Shattered Legacies is plot armor doesn't exist. There are situations that are fully viable that will get a character out of a near-death experience, but every single character can die, and a lot of them have. In fact, our big boy Duran has died multiple times. But anyway, members of the Praetorian Guard, the first division, they're essentially like gods of war. You know, these are guys that they do not fuck around. They are not going to fail a mission. In fact, the entire history of the Praetorian Guard, there has not been a single casualty. Not one. Granted, these guys are given such insane war gear that it would make, not Primarchs, it would make Primaris Space Marines blush at the sheer level of technology. Hell, the Custodians might be a little bit, you know, intimidated. So let's go over the Praetorian Guard, because they by far have the most lore out of everything. So, a very long time ago, a very special Cyratin Marine by the name of Marcus Bane was the captain of the Praetorian Guard. Well, one thing led to another in the lore, and he ended up becoming the Cyratin Supreme Commander, and was awarded a one-off job of war armor. Just fucking incredible. And it was known as the War Tortoise. It was essentially closer to a mech than a suit of power armor, because Marcus could literally, fully armored in his power armor, step into the War Tortoise. So now he has the layer of armor of the War Tortoise, followed by the layer of armor from his actual power armor, followed by the ever so slight layer of armor of his skin, followed by the extreme layer of armor of his fused bone. This dude was basically impossible to kill, but it required such exotic materials. It was essentially the equivalent of a mega carrier. You know, it wasn't capable of things on the sheer same level, but there was only one, because they had enough resources to make one. And as a result, a very long time after its original introduction to Shattered Legacies, the Cyratin Empire was like, okay, the War Tortoise is incredible, but we need more. You know, one man can only be in one location at one given time. So let's make it a little bit weaker, use some more readily available resources, and make a couple more of these suits. Well, they ended up making 20 in total, and they're still given the original namesake of the original suit of armor. They're still known as the War Tortoise. The original War Tortoise armor that was awarded to Marcus Bane is completely lost to history. Nobody has any clue where the hell it went. It's just gone. And as a result, they only have these 20 micro versions of the War Tortoise, which, wouldn't you know it, every single member of the Praetorian Guard has one. And as a result, the Praetorian Guard is only 20 members. And like I said, these guys are so fucking insane. So, even when it comes to single-digit Cyratin Marine divisions, they largely have the same war gear that everybody else has. You know, it's more energy-focused rather than ballistics-focused. The armor plates are maybe a little bit thicker, but that's it. You know, the suite of different capabilities that their AI is capable of doing may be a little bit more complex and specialized, specifically to tailor to the needs and desires of that specific Marine. But again, it's largely the same. You know, it's corrodium armor, it's X inches thick, you know, they're using the same weapons until you get to the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard are the only Cyratin Marine division that is armored with Solstite armor. And if you remember when we were talking about Corrodium and Solstite, Solstite is basically better in every single way to Corrodium. And so, as a result, they're just impossible to take down. But, as if that wasn't enough, as if their armor being heavily reinforced, having a literal exoskeleton built into it to further increase their already incredible physical capabilities, they were also given plasmite reactors and micro versions of Mega Carrier class Null Void shields. And that's why at the very beginning I did a quote, which was originally given by Cyratin Supreme Commander Marcus Bane. They shall know not fear. They shall not know, God damn it, I fucked it up. They shall not know fear. They shall know not suffering nor pain. They shall march forth into the darkness and purge what lurks within. They shall be undaunted. They shall not waver, nor falter, nor yield. They shall be our shield. They shall be our Praetorians. The Praetorian Guard has one very simple philosophy. Tactics? Nah, who needs them? They literally, no matter how much enemy fire is coming in, no matter what the enemy fire is, they walk in a single file line, shoulder to shoulder, walking, marching slowly forwards towards the enemy, unleashing the very literal definition of hell upon everything that stands in front of them. They are completely undaunted. They do not waver, they do not falter, and they do not yield. They continue their march until there is nothing but ash and dust in front of them. And honestly, there's almost nothing that can touch them. We've talked about just how insane Mega Carrier class Null Void shields are. Well, the Praetorian Guards is significantly weaker, but still, nothing short of a lance strike from orbit is going to take these guys down. You know, you need something insanely high caliber like an Archangel to punch through this Null Void shield. And even if it does, chances are it's not going to get through the armor. Now, as for their actual weapons, they have very, very specialized weapons. They have weapons that are designed to be able to unleash the maximum amount of carnage possible. So imagine the Solstite rifle and everything that we know about it so far, and then put it in the form of a mini gun. And every single one of them has it. You know, you can essentially think of War Tortoise armor as Astartes Terminator armor. You know, they march forward not giving a damn about anything that is in front of them. Marching forward without a care in the world, unleashing torrents, deluges of Solstite rounds all across the battlefield. Some of them even have a ballast variant minigun that literally just blows apart any cover. Like, solid 1-inch concrete wall with reinforced rebar cuts through it like fucking tissue paper, like a moist butt wipe. You know, these are the level of firepower that Praetorian Guard members have. There is almost nothing that can stop these guys from just continuing to march. However, there is one advantage. The original design philosophy about making these 20 suits of War Tortoise armor basically went out the window the second that they had them, because they were like, we can make literally the ultimate show of strength by sending all 20 of these guys out together. And since then, that's all they do. The Praetorian Guard is never, and I mean never, split apart. It is either all 20 members are present or none of them are present. And anywhere that they're deployed to, oh my god. Like, they can literally topple entire planetary militaries on their own. And you have to keep in mind, their weapons are directly linked to their armor. You know, energy weapons of all other Cyratin Marines, they aren't directly connected. They have their own reactors, but they're not exactly super efficient. They'll recharge the energy eventually, but it's gonna take a while. And so, as a result, they can't saturate the battlefield. Now compare that to something like the Praetorian Guard, who can literally just unleash never-ending deluges of energy bolts because it's directly connected to their plasmite reactor on their back. And the reason that they have a plasmite reactor isn't because of the insane energy consumption of the Null Void shield, although that is certainly a factor. It's so that they can, again, do this unending deluge. Now, that being said, not all of them are just straight up fucking Terminators, because that's basically what they are. You know, Terminator robots. There are certain members of the Praetorian Guard that are specialized, such as one of the War Tortoise rigs has been charged with a basically super heavy cannon variant of plasmite. And basically, it takes a long time to charge, but once it's fully charged, it will blast through any fortification that is in front of it. Even if it's solid corrodium that is an inch thick. Keep in mind how insane the corrodium is that we have talked about multiple times. It can punch and deliver a massive fucking hole through that level of armor, you know? And members of the Praetorian Guard, it's not just those 20 and they're just left to their own devices, Because one thing about null void shields is that the level of opaqueness of the shield directly correlates to how much punishment the shield can take. If it's completely black with the white lines of the hexagons in between, it is at maximum strength. Like, it will take a direct fire from a mega carrier spinal weapon to punch through that. However, if the shield is almost completely invisible, there is very little power going to there. It's still going to take a metric shit ton of firepower to punch through it, but it's far easier than with it being higher, with it being more opaque. Or, I think that's the proper word. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the proper word. But you get the idea. Now, certain Praetorian Guard members aren't alone. The Cyratin Empire, while it's not very big on the idea, they do have war machines. And let me quickly make sure that we're still recording. Perfect, we are. Okay. Sorry about that. They do have their own war machines. There are 4 primary war machines, but we're going to be going over one of them, and they are known as cataphracts. Cataphracts are totally autonomous, AI-driven robots that are just armored to high fucking hell and are used as rapid response, high-speed shock troops. They oftentimes come out in literal swarms behind the members of the Praetorian Guard. It's like that one that has the ultra-heavy plasmite cannon. He'll blow a hole in through any fortification, whilst the other members of the Praetorian Guard are covering him while he charges up. And then it's just swarms of cataphract that will just charge through the breach, just absolutely maiming anything that's on the other side. And these things are designed to move incredibly fast, give the enemy very little time to react. They have melee mode, or they have melee variants, they have ranged variants, they even have heavy ranged variants in case there's something particularly nasty on the other side that needs to be dealt with quickly. Furthermore, as if that wasn't enough, cataphracts, when sufficiently damaged, they also have a self-destruct mode, which is quite powerful. It's like a tactical missile strike when they go critical, or they simply cannot move anymore and the enemy is within range. They'll just blow themselves up. So, yeah. Beyond that, there is one final division that we can talk about, and this is Division 0. Now, this specific division, there is quite literally only a handful of individuals who know about it. In fact, there are only 3 individuals who know about it. This being the Cyratin Supreme Commander, the High Grand Inquisitor of the Cyratin Empire, and the Cyratin Emperor himself. Division 0 is known as the Night Sentinels. And the Night Sentinels have equipment that would make even Adeptus Custodians jealous. Now, when it comes to the Praetorian Guard, each and every single piece of their equipment is handcrafted by experts in their field to ensure that these things are as masterful as possible. And then you have the Night Sentinels, which are basically, it's not experts crafting this stuff. It's literally the absolute highest big head honcho grand master themselves that is constructing this stuff. And the Night Sentinels have technology that the Cyratin Empire, even the Supreme Commander, isn't even aware exists. They utilize something known as light weaponry. And I'm not saying light weaponry as in, a light armor-penetrating weapon. No, I mean literal light weaponry. It is the direct opposite to antimatter. When antimatter hits something, it just obliterates it. The duality of matter and antimatter coming into contact with each other just straight up blinks it out of reality. It just doesn't exist anymore. They just vaporize each other. Whereas light weaponry is designed for armor piercing. Now, to say that the Night Sentinels are incredibly skilled at what they do is an understatement. As I said, there are only 3 individuals who even know that they exist. They have armor and systems in their armor that is so absurd that even the Praetorian Guard would be envious of their capabilities. Their armor has what is known as the Chameleon Mantle, which is something that a sub-faction we haven't talked about yet, known as the Red Wraith Black Ops, has, which renders them completely and utterly invisible. There is not a single sensor, not even the Florians can deploy a sensor that can pick up these guys. And their sole job, the only individual that they respond to, is they take orders from the Cyratin Emperor, and their sole job is to protect the Cyratin Emperor. They're literally the equivalent of the custodians. The custodian's sole job is to protect the God Emperor. The Night Sentinel's sole job is to protect the Cyratin Emperor. And as a result, these guys spend almost their entire lives with the Chameleon Mantle on. You could be standing next to one. This dude who makes Praetorian Guards look like fucking children, who could easily just reach his hand down and squish your head like it's a grape, and you would have no clue he's there. You wouldn't even have a subtle sensation that, it feels like somebody is standing right next to me. No, not even that. There is literally no way that you know this guy is standing there. And he can move, and there is literally no way that you can detect him. With invisibility, it's usually reflecting light around you to make it seem like what is behind you is what is on the front of your armor, and as a result, it has this appearance of being completely invisible. However, when you move, there's these slight distortions as the light ripples in ways that it's not supposed to. Chameleon Mantles don't have that. It's just straight up, you can never see the guys. And as a result, even the Cyratin Emperor doesn't know how many of these guys are. The Night Sentinels, they'll prowl around and find Cyratin Marines that show great promise. And they'll reveal themselves to that chosen individual and be like, do you wish to join the Night Sentinels? And it's completely optional. If the Cyratin Marine is like, nah, I'd rather stick with my division, they're like, okay, you never saw us. And they literally, Cyratin Marines will take a death oath, which basically means until the day they die, they will not reveal what they have seen or have been told. And they will take a death oath that claims that they will never tell anybody about the existence of Night Sentinels. And as a result, so I can't remember if I had mentioned this before, but light weapons, if antimatter weapons are designed to obliterate whatever they touch, light weapons are designed for just sheer armor penetration. They can penetrate through damn near anything. Now, we got over multiple times how insanely overpowered Corrodium is. And then you take Soul State, which is even more insane. And a Cyratin Mega Carrier, one's like the HMS's Judgment of Dawn, which is the only one that has Soul State armor plating. It only has an inch thick of armor plating, and there is nothing that is getting through that. But light weapons that the Night Sentinels have, they could probably punch through an inch Soul State armor plating and still go through several more inches. Because it's an unidentified particle that is fired beyond light speed. And as a result, it just annihilates anything it touches and just keeps going. And so it's theoretically, it can punch through an unlimited amount of armor. And as a result, they really are feared. You don't know that they're there, but every once in a blue moon, when an important member of the Cyratin government is threatened, they'll all of a sudden, like, investigators will come in and the member of the government is perfectly safe and fine, and they'll just look around and they'll, like, notice a bullet hole like a bullet hole in a wall, and they'll kind of get down level with it and just peer through it with one eye, and they can see outside. And there's like 50 walls between them and the outside, and they can just see clean through to the outside. And like, if they really squint or they have eye augmetics, they can even see like a couple, maybe like a mile down the road, there's another building, and every single wall in the building just has the exact same bullet hole perfectly through it. And they're like, what in the fuck happened? And there's just a dude slumped down next to that wall that has, again, that perfect same bullet hole. And they just can never figure it out, because the Cyratin Emperor, when an individual of the government is believed to be in danger, or simply just because I like this member of the government in specific, they'll just dole out a single Night Sentinel and be like, protect this guy, make sure he doesn't die, and they'll never die from assassination. Because, like, I oftentimes try not to compare things to custodians, because the custodians are just so insane. The Night Sentinels are a fair match, if not better, than custodians. Maybe not in martial prowess, but their war gear will definitely kill a custodian in a single shot. You know? And it's like, I can't remember who had said this, but there was somebody in Warhammer 40k that had said this, that the Astartes fight like a pack of wolves. They stay in squads and they fight together, whereas the custodians fight like lions. They stand alone and just have a panoply of destruction all around them. You know? The Night Sentinels are the exact same way. They fight as lions, annihilating everything around them, whereas even the Praetorian Guard still technically fight like a pack of wolves. But, so yeah, you guys can probably hear it in my voice. My voice is incredibly sore right now, so we're going to cut the episode there. As per usual, there is so much more information about these guys, but we'll cover it when we get to it. Once again, these general deep dives of a specific faction, they're to give you a general idea of their overall capabilities. I realized that I didn't really sell Cyratin Marines all that well, you know? I didn't really explain them as well as I probably could have, but you get the idea. They're insanely overpowered 9 times, maybe not 9 times, 8 times out of 10, they're going to beat an Astartes in single combat. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed, as well as I hope you guys enjoy the 7 Days to Die episode that's coming out today, because I wasn't able to do it yesterday, as well as the one coming out tomorrow, Wednesday, as well as our Friday one, and then our Saturday and Sunday night lives. This coming up this weekend at noon Central Standard Time. So until then, guys, see ya.